Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. This is being recorded for Channel 50, CW50, for Mark's show, and it's being recorded for the Hill Center, and it's being recorded for NBC4, our station, and it's going to be put on our website probably tomorrow after we edit, Mr. Wells. So we're going to talk for an hour. We're going to talk about the point of these discussions. We're going to try to do them quarterly, but we've rushed a few more people in. We want you to hear something about the people who represent you or work for you as public officials, something more than what you hear at some of the chaotic forums, something you hear more than, it's more you like sitting in your living room. So we're going to start, and first of all, we'll say, Mr. Wells, thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
Well, I think you have to talk into it.
My pleasure, Tom.
That's not on. Okay. You have failed the first test.
So rare for anything to go wrong with the Hill Center.
I got my first tweet.
Okay. Now, and you may tweet this. Mr. Wells has just
So
insulted
is
his
this
host.
is working now? Okay, I got it. Excellent.
All right, good. So we're just going to get started. I have the first question, since it's essentially my show. You're a grown man, but you're
Thank
called
you.
Tommy. My name is Tom Sherwood. I was called Tommy when I was a child. Tommy do this and Tommy do that. Tell me something about, have you always been called Tommy? Tell me something about your early life. I think you're from Texas, but something about why you're called Tommy, and I guess do your relatives still call you that?
I tried 1 year as Tom, and it was a miserable year. And so I went back to Tommy. It was just all bad luck, and I went back to Tommy. And I thought if we had a president named Jimmy, that it was not a killer in politics to be known as Tommy. But my family was originally from Minnesota, and they've all moved back up there now. But my father was going into the seminary, and he was sent down in the Episcopal Church and was sent down to Austin, Texas. And that's where I was born, in Austin. And then in the end, he ended up going into public health. They moved around the country and ended up in Alabama. And so I was in Alabama from second grade through beginning of graduate school. Went to graduate school in Minnesota, and I went to a professor's office and said, it's too cold here in Minnesota, and I'm not going to go back to Alabama. Where would you go? And he had worked for Jimmy and Carter and said, I would love to live in Washington, D.C. if I could. That's where I like the best. So I went home, sold my car for a train ticket. Had never been here before, took the Southern Crescent 30 years ago, overnight train, and got to Union Station before it was renovated. I had met one person that I knew would be up here at Catholic University. We didn't have cell phones then. So I had the Traveler's Aid folks.
What year was that?
It was 1983, September 5th. And so I got on the Metro. I'd never been on a subway before. It was like being at Disney World. I was pretty excited. And really fell in love with Washington at that time. It's just my heart started racing, never slowed down from then.
Do you have siblings, brothers and sisters, or
I'm the
how
youngest.
big is this family?
I'm the youngest of three. My brother lives back in Minnesota, and my sister lives back in Minnesota. And she's got 2 kids. My brother has 2 kids. And we had my niece here up until she was here for 5 years and just moved away.
Are you the only person in your family in public office?
Yes.
Are you the only one who's tried?
My mother made phone calls for Richard Nixon, which she denies.
That sounds like a setup line. All right. I was talking to Aaron Wieners, a reporter for the Washington. I'm sorry, you got more to this story?
My great-grandfather was a state senator in Minnesota, and he was a Republican.
Okay, so you started
You
off.
always been a Democrat?
Absolutely. Republican Party was different then, Mark.
So they tell me.
I want to ask you something because I thought it was interesting. Aaron Wiener wrote about you in the Washington City paper, and he says that you're like a nut for trees, that you stop your conversation about serious matters, not that trees aren't, and say, hey, look at that tree. What kind of tree is that? Where did your obsession with trees come from?
Well,
The Casey trees people want to know.
you know, I have to say that I think a lot of us that live around here and are in the district do a number of things, and so I don't think this will be unusual, that I do want to know what the environment is around me. And so you walk by trees every day. And I realized one day I had no idea what it was. And so not only did I start learning trees, I learned that streets have different trees. A lot of people here know that. But I also learned birds. My staff will tell you from the campaign, when we're driving by, I'll say, what kind of column is that? Is that Ionic, Doric, or Corinthian? And then sometimes I trick them because there's also a Tuscan. But I want to know the built environment around me. I want to know what things are. And so trees are just one of those things. And so this guy, Aaron, spends, a full unfettered day with me and goes, I thought I'd try to be more interesting than just knocking on the next door.
I'm going to ask you one more question and let Mark get in here, but I want to also suggest to you that you do have some human beings to your right. So
thank you, Tom.
Just
hey, guys.
occasionally
Glad y'all
look
could
over
come.
there when you're answering, particularly have some good to say. Casey Trees wants to know if you support the 40% canopy for the city, the Sustainable DC effort to replant many more trees. Would you do something? Do you like what's being done? Would you like to do more to change the environment of the city? And incidentally, can we just wait a moment? Diamond, would you raise your hand there? She's the timekeeper, and she'll be letting us know when it's time to wrap up. We're going to do this for 1 hour, and that's it. So back to the trees, 40% canopy. What are we doing, or we should be doing?
What I would like to do, everybody here knows what LEED certified buildings are. And there's movement towards LEED certified neighborhoods. I would like a standard that we have a LEED certified city. That's a very different way to look at how your city operates. It includes trees, it includes, the things that we do for our built environment, but it also means things like, I'll give you an example. We have an aggregate plant down by the end of South Capitol Bridge. And what it does is when we tear a building down, we send all the chunks of concrete there, it makes big ones and the little ones, and then we use that aggregate for our roads. If we don't have that aggregate plant and it's about to be displaced, it means we're going to truck it out, and then when we need the aggregate, we'll truck it in. And it'll be a tremendous amount of truckloads. And the point of that being is that you wouldn't catch that in a LEED certified building necessarily, or in a LEED neighborhood. What I want is a LEED city, which means a tree canopy. It means that we work in a way that is the most sustainable possible. And that's something that I'd like to set for the city.
We're going to bring Mark in and talk about how you got into the ANC, school board, council. Mark, I'm going to start from there.
No, actually, I'd like to back up because I'm kind of interested in this whole personal life of the candidate. Actually intrigues me. Tell us a little bit something more about Tommy Wells that we know. For instance, imagine my surprise when I was in the mosh pit at a Grateful Dead show, and I looked to my right.
Whose show is this?
And who should I see to my right but Councilmember Wells?
What year was this?
In all honesty, this was at Barack Obama's inauguration where the Grateful Dead reunited. Nonetheless, there was a section for VIPs.
We were not doing nitrous oxide
there
balloons.
There was a section for VIPs and dignitaries, and then there was the mosh pit, which is where I found the council member. So tell us a little bit about your history with the Grateful Dead and anything else you don't want us to know about your past.
Well, I never was one to travel around the country for the Dead. And Mark, knowing that you may or may not have done that, this is something I don't know whether you want to disclose, so I have no judgment about that.
I'll ask the questions.
We're actually going to do a series of interviews with journalists if any of them will accept.
But the Grateful Dead was very much a part of the milieu and culture growing up. I grew up in Alabama, and the folks I grew up with, I was very involved in the Episcopal Church. That was really the place to find progressive folks in a very red state. And my friends we listened to the Dead. It was just part of what we did in our tie-dye T-shirts, and I did inhale, and that was part of growing up.
And how old are you now?
I'm 56 years old, and in February, on the 27th, I will turn 57. Same birthday as Chelsea Clinton and Elizabeth Taylor, and Elizabeth won't be there this year.
So let's then start to your public life in D.C. And I recall the first time I think we met, you were on the ANC here, and the hot issue back then was Boys Town, coming down to the property across from Potomac Metro. Can you just talk a little bit about those times in your work on the ANC?
Well, one of the biggest issues when I was first elected was Ellen Wilson. And many of you that was here then, Ellen Wilson was a failed public housing. It was abandoned. And the city had decided to use a Hope 6 grant, one of the earliest ones, to tear it down and then build mixed use, but mixed income, but still all affordable housing. It's just income tiered, still essentially public housing. And so there was, there's a lot of energy around this. One is some homeless vets climbed the smokestack and said they weren't going to come down unless it was kept open as public housing. And eventually they were negotiated down, and then the neighbors in the neighborhood had never seen anything like what was proposed and assumed it'd be more failed public housing. And so it was very controversial. I see Mimi here where Dick Wolf and many others were involved to try to make this happen. And so as the ANC commissioner, we held hearings, and I came out in support of building Ellen Wilson. And
Where is this?
Ellen Wilson is just north of the freeway in between 6th Street and 8th Street, 7th Street.
Mayor Williams was mayor at the time?
No. That would have been Marion Barry. This was 1995, 96. And so I got involved to provide support and try to convince the ANC to support building Ellen Wilson, and that I thought it would work. And I was interviewed by the Post. It was one of my first times, being interviewed by guys like you guys, and they called me Pollyannish to believe that this would actually work. And the rest is history. Ellen Wilson is one of the most successful affordable housing, public housing, Hope 6 projects in the nation. It's never been replicated. It's never been replicated in the city. It should be replicated. As mayor, I will replicate it. That's, public housing does not have to be stigmatizing. It can be beautiful and wonderful like Ellen Wilson. I'm really proud of what we did here. So I got very involved in that as ANC commissioner.
And what were you doing when you were on the ANC? What job did you have?
I was a social worker in D.C. That was basically my first main job, and I worked in child protection up until 1991. And if you'll remember, or those that know, the city went through a terrible time through the late 80s. We went broke. We had the crack epidemic. We were the murder capital of America. It was the beginning of HIV and AIDS. We went from 1,500 children in foster care to 3,000 children in foster care. Families were falling apart. And I got involved. Now, one thing that some people don't know is that I had some political experience. So when I first got my job as a social worker, I was asked to come out in 1986 to run and organize Ward 6 for Marion Barry for his third re-election. He had not smoked crack. I didn't have to explain anything to my mother yet. And I was the coordinator for Ward 6. Now, think about this. You're in your mid to late 20s. Where they put my office was the new party room at the Hawk and Dove. And so my job, each morning I'd get up and go to the Hawk and Dove. We put tables in there and made our phone calls. And so I worked for Marion Barry and helped him get reelected.
That was Stu Long on the Hawk and Dove.
Yes.
So.
This was the only white area in Washington that voted for Marion Barry that time. And then I asked to go back to my old job. I didn't ask for a patronage job, anything else. I said I want to go back and be a child protection social worker. And I did. Then really all hell broke loose in terms of crack, going broke. And I felt somewhat responsible. I'd helped Marion get reelected. And also responsible just because I was a social worker and called to social justice. So I helped organize the social workers. There's a whole series of post interviews of showing what was wrong. Nothing changed. And I had brought in the ACLU, and we brought a class action lawsuit against the city called LaShawn versus Barry. And that's the lawsuit the city's still under for rebuilding its child welfare system. So that's how I kind of got politicized. And I went and put myself through law school at Catholic at Night while I was a social worker. And then I came out and I was asked to run the Consortium for Child Welfare, which was a LOS association. I incorporated it, and I spent the next 15 years on the private side rebuilding the safety net for children and families in D.C.
And when did you first run for the council?
I ran in 2006. Yes.
Did you Adrian Fenty, did you have his endorsement? I think you did, didn't you?
No, I had Sharon Ambrose's endorsement, but I had served a term and a half on the DC School Board representing wards 5 and 6. That's when Anthony Williams created districts rather than just representing wards. So I was the first representative for that new hybrid school board, represented 5 and 6, and because they staggered the terms, I got to tell you how hard it was when I decided to run for school board, and they said, now you have to run in wards 5 and 6, and you have to run against the incumbents for both of those 2 wards. And at that time, that district would have been at best about 25 to 30% white. And so I won a plurality, and then they said, you got the short stick, we're going to stagger the terms, you got to run again within 2 years. So I ran again, and I ran in 5 and 6, and I went head-to-head against a nice guy named Ben Bonham. Now, Ben Bonham had been the Ward 6 representative, and he grew up in Ward 5, so it was a tough race, but with strong support out of both Ward 6 and 5, I won. So from there, when Sharon got very ill and decided not to run for re-election, I ran for the Ward 6 seat.
And won.
I won that one,
What
too.
percentage-wise?
That was, I think it was like 60-some%, but then when I ran for re-election, I won with 75%.
Well, let's talk about your council work. Do you consider the fee, bag tax that you call a fee, is that your best legislation? It's important for those who want to clean up the river, but...
Let me say that one of the new things that when I was elected, usually council members don't have committees, like Grasso does not have a committee. McDuffie originally was not. And so the first thing I did when I was elected, I was given the Committee of Human Services, Child Welfare, Juvenile Justice, Homeless Services, Income Support. And what I did in those 4 years is that we brought in something called Housing First. I helped shepherd that into the city. The first time they brought the money for Housing First, it was put in Housing Committee, and they moved the money. The council wouldn't spend it. They didn't believe in Housing First. Second time they put it in my committee, and we housed over 800 of the most chronically homeless folks in the city, folks that no one else could serve. These were the people under the bridges yelling at themselves, chronic illness, mental illness, and then also drug addicted. And we got over 800. We closed Franklin Shelter, as you remember, to much chagrin. I worked closely with the mayor.
Still closed.
That's right. So I shepherded in Housing First. And at the time, it's interesting, Catholic University School of Social Work, their professors had me come talk to them because they thought it was a terrible idea. And we did it, and I helped shepherd it through, and it's been wildly successful. As many of you know that read the paper and read Colby King didn't believe in the reforms we were doing in our juvenile justice system. He wrote over and over, this doesn't make any sense. So I stood by juvenile justice reform, and now we've got fewer committed wards in the juvenile justice system than we've had in 30 or 40 years, and that either the kids aren't killing each other anymore like they had been, and juvenile crime is the recidivism rate, which is important when you get into the system, has dropped dramatically. The other thing, of course, was the child welfare system. We had the Benita Jacks case. I'd barely been there, not quite a year, and we had a mom who had been involved in the child welfare system kill 4 of her children. And it was horrific. And what I didn't want is I didn't want Congress to have an oversight hearing on the city again. So I put together an extremely extensive oversight hearing that started with the phone calls the social worker from the schools was making. I don't know if y'all were there, but I played those and then took it through a full oversight. Congress never said a word. And then I created legislation called Repairing the Safety Net so that that wouldn't happen again. So I created something through legislation called a differential response so that they had better ways to respond to any kind of call to the child welfare system, and then continued with the other things. So all those improved, and then I had oversight of the transportation department and Department of Public Vehicles, and I was there, and then I got a call from another colleague saying, what are you going to do about the chair that got 2 SUVs? And it looks terrible. And I had just gotten the committee, and I said, I'm going to investigate. And so I investigated the chair and all the city officials that were illegally misappropriating dollars by using drivers, using SUVs. Knowing that my committee would not approve the report, I released it to you guys as a preliminary report. And after 6 months, I got a lot done in 6 months. We doubled bike share, started Car to Go, moved a circulator to east of the river. It's the first one to get over there, fully funded metro. But that summer, the council voted that with the chair, that I no longer chair transportation and such. And so they did not think the chair should have been held accountable.
Let's interrupt this just one quick moment. You mentioned Colby King from the Washington Post. You told me, and I heard that you were at the Washington Post today for the their interview for possibly endorsing people. I think they like to keep those sessions fairly quiet. You were there with one staff person. But what can you tell us that was like? First of all, was Colby there?
No.
So can you give us a little insight into what it's like to sit before the powers that be at the Washington Post? Was Jeff Bezos there?
Well,
was it just a little bit of taste of what it's like? Don't just disclose anything.
Well, the first thing is that I had been through the process 4 times, 2 school board races, 2 council races, and there had never been more than 2 folks from the Washington Post there, and usually just 1. And I had been through endorsement interviews with Colby King before when I ran for school board. And so I've known Colby a long time. So today I went in and long table, and this time usually they have me sit at the end of the table, and they say sit in the middle on the other side. And then what came in were about 10 people. And so right away it was different. But what was interesting is I was introduced to them. What I didn't expect was Tom Tolles. I just would not have thought that the cartoonist for the Washington Post, but of course he's on the editorial pages. Why not? So Tom Tolles was there, and he was, when you give your answers to the Post and they say, what about this, what about that, and you're animated and you're mayoral, he never flinched. He was the most dour, I was like, I'm not reaching Tom Tolles. He's like, I'm being pretty animated here and pretty compelling, and he's not nodding with me. So that was one of the things I took away from there.
Was he drawing? Was he doodling? Maybe getting more?
No, he was just looking. He was leaning back, looking kind of grim, and
like I am now.
And so it was.
Joanne Armeo was there.
She was in the
She's
middle,
the principal
facing off with me.
writer for the Washington Post for City Matters. They have somebody from Maryland, Virginia. She's a principal city person. What was she like? She was my city editor for us. She could be pretty grumpy.
Well, I'm used to Joanne. I mean, they all were about as animated as Joanne. They just are stone-faced. And I did say a couple of things I thought were funny, and I heard some chuckles. They were very quiet, but they chuckled. And it was very interesting. I think I can disclose at least one of the questions that they asked about the Hyde Act. And the pursuant on the Hyde Act was that some young guy, and my campaign manager said I'm getting too old because I thought he looked like an intern, but said started trying to challenge me on smart growth principles about density. And so we had a quick conversation about the smart growth principles, is that smart growth is not just one dimension. There's a lot of things that happen, underneath there. It was a very interesting conversation. But
did you take a position on high rises?
Oh, absolutely. There's no reason yet to raise the height limit. There's no reason. The reason you raise the height limit is to increase development. We've got about a third of the commercial development in America going on right now, so I don't know how badly we want to increase development. And then the other is, our city is changing rapidly, but the world is changing rapidly on how we deal with the built environment. That you all see where there's more offices. Not everybody gets an office anymore. They have group spaces. We organize differently. So even if we don't lose one company, we need less office buildings that we currently have. There's a discussion with the downtown bid of repurposing some downtown offices into housing. And as you all know, that housing is getting really small. That we have micro units, and the apartments that rent the fastest are 1 bedrooms and efficiencies. And that's because when we build these buildings now, we put in a business center. We put in other, not just a lounge and party room, but also a place to walk your dog in these buildings. And so how you relate to space is dramatically changing through a collective idea of how we live. We don't need the same amount of space for housing, or we're not doing it, than we used to, and it's more affordable because the footprints are smaller, the units. So I won't go too far into that, but it's not a linear discussion about how much space we need. And then the other thing is, we've got Reservation 13, Walter Reed, McMillan, Poplar Point, St. Elizabeth. We've got so much acreage that if the priority is to have affordable housing, then that ought to be the priority, not just putting extra stories on buildings. And so we can be a lot smarter in prioritizing that and not just going to the developer that can make the most money.
Let me go back to what you were saying about DYRS. You seem to paint a pretty rosy picture that no kids have been murdered and no kids have committed murders. Is that the benchmark for a Wells administration? But let me ask you, are there enough beds for DYRS youths? And as a mayor, would you keep the head of DYRS in place? And are you comfortable with the relationship between DYRS and the DC Superior Court judges?
First thing is that we used to have Oak Hill. Oak Hill was a lousy, lousy place. We had over 280 escapes from Oak Hill in 1 year. In 1 year. So when Colby King
But you had a lot more beds than you do now.
Absolutely. And so when Colby King said that there had been 3 escapes from New Beginnings, that was not a disaster, and that was in a year. And so the model that we're using is a model that has been proven to work. As you know, it's called the Missouri model. What I would have and did fault Vinny Schiraldi on was that he did not get the neighborhood support.
Say who he was. He was the director.
Vinny Schiraldi was director of DYRS under Anthony Williams. Adrian Fenty kept him, and he was a reformer to bring a reform model in. The deal is that it's more important to work smart, and we know that the longer that we incarcerate the young folks, that when they come back, they're more violent, and they're more likely to commit a crime. And so bringing them back into the community with supports works, but he didn't bring the supports in fast enough, and that was my emphasis, was to be sure that the supports were in, like the Barge Center that we see over in South Capitol. It's been very successful, but the youth go there every day after school, and it's part of being back in the community. We can be a lot smarter, reduce crime, and so, frankly, you look at my website and stuff, I believe that we can cut the number of crimes committed by teenagers in half in just 2 years. And I think we can do that by being very smart. And so
what does being very smart mean?
Every kid that wants an after-school job should get one. B, every part of the D.C. government, 30,000 employees and its agencies should have part of its mission, youth. DMV, down in the middle of a very difficult area with a lot of public housing in Southwest. Part of them being there should be also apprenticeships, internships, having youth engaged in what they do as part of their mission. The other thing is, one way to get less criminals, and I don't mean to be flip, is to make less things a crime, is what Clarence Darrow said. 90% of all arrests for small amounts of marijuana, African American, primarily youth. As we know, with 6 universities here, the only people smoking pot are not black kids. Not to stereotype our college kids, but it's true. So once there's no reason to get sucked into the court system, the juvenile justice system, for small amounts of marijuana. So as everybody probably knows, I've just put through a bill to decriminalize small amounts of marijuana. A comprehensive approach. Another way to do it in the 9th Ward. Now, I won't go too far, Tom. But in the 9th Ward in New Orleans, they had a problem with juvenile crime, and they had a problem with a lot of abandoned houses and the seniors staying in their houses being disconnected. AARP hired an organizer to get the seniors in walking clubs. And they started their walking clubs and doing their walking clubs, and juvenile crime went down. Why? Because they were walking at the time that kids were getting out of school, and they quit committing crimes. We can be smart. And you've seen what we've done with the built environment. H Street Northeast. The number one retail used to be heroin at 8th and H. And then when we put the lights on the sidewalks and lit it up to where people can no longer hide in the dark crevices and areas, we have H Street has had one of the greatest drops in crime of any street. We can change how we do the built environment. We can focus on youth in a smart way to get them engaged. We've got to get the graduation rate up to at least 80%. Right now it's barely 60%. And that is going to be our workforce for tomorrow, but it'll be transformative for all of us.
So let me ask you.
Can we only go to marijuana?
I'm sure you do.
I'm a baby boomer.
It sounds like you want to have seniors out there patrolling the streets to keep kids from committing crimes. Let me ask you.
I would
arm the seniors?
I would love to have the youth walking with the seniors, to be with them, to see if and kind of be marshals with them after school when they walk together. And
Let me ask you about something the Gray administration is doing right now, and they're calling it soft postings. And this is deploying firefighters in fire trucks into neighborhoods with high crime in the middle of the night and having them sit in their vehicles as a deterrent to crime. Kenyon McDuffie in Ward 5 in Northeast, where this is going on, supports this. The mayor, the chief of police, the fire chief, the deputy mayor all support this. How about you?
And you're the chairman of the Public Safety Committee.
I think it's a bad idea. I think we all see where if you have a crime spike and you want to park a squad car there with police whose job is to figure out how to interdict or stop crime, it's not the job of the firefighters to do it. Our firefighters try to sleep. To post them in their truck overnight like that when they should be sleeping, be ready for a fire, does not make sense. That's not what they're trained for. That's not what they do. And I would not do that. If you need more police, let's hire more police.
Chief Ellerby has been the fire chief under Mayor Gray, and he's had a controversial reign. You've been critical. Mark has covered several stories of hearings you've had, but you've never called on him to either be fired or for him to resign and move in a different direction. Why not?
Well, I have to meet with him regularly. On your behalf, I have to meet with this guy and see that he's doing his job and that he's making progress and he's being held accountable. I can't hire and fire him. So if I'm in the press saying he should be fired, by the way, we're going to be meeting, in an hour or two, it doesn't make any sense. It's the mayor who has to be held accountable for our city to look at Ellerby and say, it's your fault, Ellerby. They put no money in the fiscal year 13 for replacing any trucks. That's not just Ellerby. That's Alan Liu. That's the rest of these guys. And then when they did finally purchase ambulances and trucks, the contract fell through because they didn't do it right. And so we had to wait a long time. That the number of things that have gone wrong really is not just, it is Ellerby, and I am holding him accountable. And I tell you, I didn't go in to go after our fire chief. I had not served on the committee. I was given the Committee of Public Safety. The first oversight hearing was last January, and I did what any of you would have done. I said, could you give me an inventory of all your fire trucks and ambulances, and how old are they, so we can be sure that we're replacing them at the right rate so you have the money to have the fleet. That was just one of the questions. So he brought in a list, and it was completely fictional. The union
it was fake.
Went and
fictional
found
is a nice word.
these
It was
trucks rotting in fields in Wisconsin.
Shouldn't he be fired?
Absolutely.
All right. I want to go back to marijuana.
But you're going to need a different mayor to do it.
Okay. Last week on the Kojo show, you came in and you talked, and then Angela also Brooks, who's the prosecutor for Prince George's, came in. And you two had never met, and I asked you to turn to your right and say hello to her because you're advocating the decriminalization of marijuana, have left open the possibility at some point down the road of legalizing it, taxing it like Colorado. She is an African-American woman. She's a prosecutor, and she is just horrified by this. Even the decriminalization, she thinks that even though you have a nice idea that you don't want African-American young people to be arrested, that she said you're opening the door to more drug use. You're opening the door to an acceptability of one more thing that will take children out of school to distract them from what should be community-building episodes, not smoking marijuana. What was your answer to her?
Well, it truly is that it's a social justice issue that we know from studies or surveys that African-American youth are not the only ones smoking pot. But when you get caught with a drug charge, that means you're not going to get a commercial driver's license. That means you're not going to work on a construction site. That means if you're coming from an area where you have the highest unemployment in the city, you've got some strikes and blows against you for doing something that is not demonstrable to say that, the studies do not bear out that you necessarily in any way go into harder drugs. I'm not going to ask anybody here to raise your hand if you've ever smoked pot and then didn't go on to harder drugs. But unless you're up here.
Well, how about you, sir? Did they lead?
I already said I inhaled. No, well, it depends on
anything harder for you.
I think Scotch is a harder drug, absolutely. And but I think I would have, I would sip Scotch or have a beer whether I had smoked pot or not, and those are harder drugs.
What about drug testing? I mean, you talk about, decriminalizing marijuana, and it keeps people from getting a commercial driver's license. Do we want people who smoke marijuana to have a commercial driver's license? Do we want them to be driving our school buses? Do you approve of drug testing in any workplace?
You still have a DUI. It's driving under the influence, and that includes pot. It doesn't
How do
mean...
they test for pot?
Well, if there's a blood test.
A blood test for pot?
Yeah.
All kinds of tests. But do you favor, would a Wells administration be in favor of drug testing, perhaps school bus drivers, police officers, council members?
A lot of tests for councilmen. While you're thinking of that answer, if you have a question, a 4x5 card, you want to pass it up to Mark, and he'll ignore it. We're doing pretty good so far.
Thank you, Tom.
But you haven't answered that question about drug testing.
I forgot.
No, I'm not. I don't think that unless there's a problem to be addressed, and I don't think we have a problem of our bus drivers that I know of doing errant bad things because they've smoked pot. I think that to assume there's a problem, start drug testing is fairly invasive, and I think there should be a cause or a nexus or a problem to be solved before we start looking for a solution without a problem.
I want to talk to you one more time about personality, and then we're going to get into the issues of the mayor's race specifically, because it reflects a lot of what you're doing, what you're trying to do with ethics and all these other things. With the city paper, to mention them again, dubbed you Council St. Martyr. Is that right? Councilor St. Martyr? Council Martyr, Tommy Wells. When the Kwame Brown took away your committee, all your committee, all the council members voted with him, even though they didn't particularly like him. What about seem to be very friendly here. What is it to get anything done on the council, you have to have 6 other votes, to have 7 at minimum, sometimes 9. What is it about your personality that you think makes you an outsider, or is it your positions on ethics and other issues?
Well, a couple things. You're right. The other council members, including the ones running for mayor, vote against campaign finance reform every time. Now, in terms of the other stuff, bag bill was unanimous. I just did a minimum wage bill, as many of you know. I got 9 co-introducers, and Tom, you know that's different from co-sponsors. They put their name on it, so I knew it could not be vetoed by the mayor, so it'd be veto-proof. I just did that. I got 10 council members on the pot bill, which at the time, people didn't know whether the council members would support it or not. It's certainly the bills related to campaign finance reform. And in terms of being Councilmember Martyr St. Tommy, part of that is the standards that the people of Ward 6 set. They won't accept anything less. That if I do digress, if I, this is a very high standard on Ward. And I know my predecessor met up to that, but the truth is that is, I think ethics are extremely important. I think that ethics, and I think we have a culture of corruption in our elected government, and I think that's the one thing that will undo our progress, and so I've worked against it.
Do you think Vincent Gray has been corrupt as mayor? You talk about corruption in our government. You talk about his campaign being corrupt. But as mayor, he wants to run on his record as mayor.
He was mayor when they appointed Suleiman Brown to a job the man was not qualified for and was fired. As mayor, yes. And then as mayor, he brought, and this is what disappointed me personally, he brought us a bill to give more money in the contract to Jeffrey Thompson. And I was a swing vote on that. He and his administration came to me and said, we need this. We've got to have this bill. Jeffrey Thompson in Chartered Health deserves it. And the only elected official at the time who had never taken a dime from Jeffrey Thompson. I didn't do it to help Jeffrey Thompson because I'd never taken a dime from him. I did it because the mayor asked me to. I voted for it, and then I find out that Jeffrey Thompson gave Vince Gray's campaign $650,000 to protect his contract. I think that whether that is connected through emails or whatever, I think it was a quid pro quo, and I think that I was duped.
Have you been interviewed by the prosecutor's office or anything like that about any of this?
Apparently, I'm the only one not to be subpoenaed by those guys.
And do you think that the mayor should say more about it? I've been told that within the mayor's own operation that I'm not answering these questions. My lawyer says, I need to just focus on my job as mayor. Should he say more? And if so, what should he say?
The collapse of Charter Health has just cost us $40 million. The reason it collapsed is because Jeffrey Thompson was under investigation for funding Vince Gray's campaign. He's cost us a lot of money already. And then the other thing is that this is why we need an independent attorney general. That we have an attorney general that won't turn over documents to an investigating authority who's trying to see if it was quid pro quo is unbelievable. It undermines all of our confidence that the attorney general is representing you and not the sitting mayor. And so I think that's an ongoing
I thought he
problem.
had reached an agreement with Machen on that, though.
Agreement.
A partial agreement. Why wouldn't he turn over all the documents? What's the attorney general what's the U.S. attorney going to do with them? I mean, is he afraid? What are they afraid of the U.S. attorney from finding out from the executive branch?
On ethics, are you the only candidate for mayor who's not accepting corporate contributions?
Absolutely. The first one ever.
I did look at your campaign reports, and you do have some contributions from individuals who
Yep.
are like sole proprietor of corporations,
Yep.
and they give you the full amount, $2,000, but their corporation themselves don't give you $2,000. What is the distinction? An individual is okay even if it's a sole proprietor?
The first thing is that every contribution has a name on it and an address. So it's not bundled limited liability corporations that you don't know who owns them. So first off, you know who they are. The second is you can only give once. If you have a corporation or a number of restaurants or a number of limited liability corporations, you can give 10 and 20 times. For me, you can give once. And I tell you, I believe that, you look at Ward 6 and what I could do if I took corporate contributions. There's $14 billion of development in Ward 6. $14 billion in Ward 6. From the buying the property, permitting, to cutting the ribbon. I believe I could round up a lot of money. But I would then, who do I answer to when we're talking about the different things that developers will need? Do I answer to them or do I answer to you? It feels a lot better that I'll take a check from Douglas Jamal, but only one, his name on it with his address, and not from his, I don't know how many limited liability corporations.
That would be your policy if you were to become mayor.
Absolutely.
No change.
I've gotten rid of my constituent services fund. When they did a research on who actually spends their constituent services funds, and we can have up to $40,000. We get money from people and corporations. Do they really spend it on your constituents for, keeping the heat on, for burial? They did a study and they said that, you only spent 32% of your constituent services money on constituents, but it's more than any other council member spent on constituent services. And I decided, I think that it just doesn't look right at all, so I ended my constituent services fund.
Several of the questions that we've gotten from the audience center around education in one form or another. So let me try to wrap them all into one quick question here. One, how do you distinguish yourself from the other candidates when it comes to education? And two, there was a hearing today about boundaries and the change that the mayor and the chancellor are proposing for boundary enrollments in the district. And I look out in this room and I remember sleeping in front of Watkins Elementary School overnight in order to get my kid into the Montessori program over there years ago. What is your plan? How do you distinguish yourself from the other candidates when it comes to education, and what about the redistricting of boundaries?
Well, the first thing is that I will be in charge of education as mayor. We've got a charter school system. We've got a traditional public school system. The twain rarely ever meet, and there's no centralized goal or vision for education for DC. You've got the different leadership groups. So as mayor, you'll get one central vision. Now, what does that mean of how to do it? I'm the only one that has actually brought back elementary schools, public schools, and I've done it with an incredible array of parents and activists through Ward 6. While they're closing schools in Ward 7, 8, and 5, we've added and are adding 3 more elementary schools in Ward 6 because of what we've been able to do together. And the first thing I did as a school board member is say that we need to have entrepreneurial leaders. So we brought in a new leaders project. We've got very entrepreneurial principals. It's a different approach. And I've met around every school with parents and say, what do you want in a school? They write it up. They come up with it. I brought in first Dr. Janey. Then I brought in the chancellor, who was ever there, and then say, can you do this? And we've done that one school at a time. It's been remarkable. So
where do the elementary, if you get success for elementary, where do the kids go for middle school? We got to get into Hines, and how many of them go to a DC high school?
Well, we have been so successful at elementary school that we've got a huge bubble coming out for middle school. We've always had Stuart Hobson. We've got a couple of schools to go to 8th grade, but we've got a lot more kids coming through now. And I believe, and this is controversial with some of our public school parents here, I believe we have to knit together the charter school options, where they have been very successful with middle schools, with traditional elementary schools in the public school system. Already, Brent Elementary, the majority of the children from Brent go to Basis and they go to Washington Latin, a charter school. Currently, other elected officials say that's the failure of the public school system. Well, you've paid for both. I view it as that is a great success that we have an option that those parents wanted, their public schools, and didn't leave the District of Columbia. They stayed here, and that's a huge success. So what we can do is that we can give preference to different elementary schools, just like feeder patterns, line up with different charter schools, along with having their in-boundary schools as a matter of right. And that's how what a mayor has to do is the only one that can knit those together. And
Kaya Henderson said that this changing the boundaries have not been changed since the 1970s. It's more difficult than closing schools. It's more difficult than deciding curricula. It is the most difficult thing she says she's ever done as a chancellor. Do you anticipate we'll start having hearings in May and June, initial plan in August, the final plan by September? Can it be done that quickly for the 2015 school year?
I don't know if it can be done that quickly, but you have to start with the guiding principle that everyone should have what we have here. Every family should have a quality elementary school that they can attend as a matter of right and they can walk to it. You don't have to go there, but we have that here. And that's why there's so many families moving here and why people want to stay here. Ward 7, Ward 8, Ward 5, and the rest of the city, everybody should have that. And that's the difference between living in a city, a successful city, or in the suburbs. So the boundaries, I don't want to create we're putting children on buses for the first time in Ward 7 and 8 and busing them to school because they don't have a neighborhood school. We've closed them. I do believe that we can have a neighborhood school for every family, and we can do there. And when people say, oh, it's because we've gentrified Ward 6, that's not it. We have more public housing in Ward 6 than any other ward. We do have economically integrated schools. We can have economically integrated schools around the city.
Can I show the poll with the 2%?
Can I stop you?
No.
I know. Go ahead.
It's Tom's show.
We're running out of time, but if you don't like my question, you can supersede it with yours. You can offer an amendment.
Ask your question.
Washington Post poll showed, you mentioned 7 and 8 several times tonight, but the Washington Post poll said you had 2% African-American support. You've worked as a social worker. You've worked in transportation. You've worked in so many areas. Is it because they don't know you or they don't like you? What is it? Why 2%?
Well, I think that you're right that they don't know my history, that I am leading the white vote in D.C. But if you look at what I've been most known for, I rode my bicycle to work because I don't have to worry about parking, and it's fast going down the hill and going back. Next thing I know, I'm the bike champion for all of Washington, and I'm responsible for all the bike lanes, and that makes people very uncomfortable that don't like to ride next to bikes. And so I've become identified, and it is true, I am a student of innovation in how cities work. I am the smart growth guy. I am the guy that's trying to figure out.
And black people aren't?
It represents change. What we have in the city is that every month about 3,000 people move out and 4,000 people move in. We are undergoing rapid change. People are very uncomfortable about that. And I'm being viewed as the representative for the millennials, for the people moving in, for the smart growth people.
The dog parks and the bikes.
So when I go back into Ward 7 and 8, which I am doing, I mean, I won school board and I won on the council because I'm an organizer. I'm a political organizer, and I put coalitions together that normally don't get together. And so you're right. I'm reintroducing myself Ward 7A when I tell them that I came here as a social worker, and what I've done in my career, it's a different conversation. I've got a group of Black Baptist ministers that have gotten involved in the campaign. I've got a religious advisor that have come from that group. And it really has been just reinventing, not reinventing, sorry, I'm not reinventing, I'm reintroducing myself. From that history, I'm not just the guy that's on the bicycle.
Why would black ministers be for you?
Because of the investment that we need to make in youth. We can cut juvenile crime in half. They like decriminalization because I see the impact on their families, their churches. And so the work that I've done and the work that I'm doing.
You had mentioned about quality neighborhood elementary schools all across the district for all DC residents. What about for special needs students, special education students, and particularly if you can talk a little bit about here in Ward 6, St. Coletta, a school that DC pays a lot of money to, that DC gave the land to, and the federal government gave the money to build the building. Was that a good deal for the residents of the District of Columbia, looking back at St. Coletta?
St. Coletta is a world-class school for children that need help. And what I did was when St. Coletta's came in, it used to be they were all paid private placement, often through court orders, that I got St. Coletta's to agree to become a charter school so that they get paid as a public charter school for the children that they serve. And so they are part of the array. They're not an outlier as a private school that just receives, a separate fee. So they're part of our. I think St. Coletta's is fabulous. It's humane. It's wonderful. It's life-giving for many of our families.
And then how do you replicate that? Because that vast majority of special needs kids in the district don't go to St. Coletta, and many of them actually go out of the city, out of state. Cost the district a lot of money. How do you bring them into neighborhood schools, get them into schools?
Well, the first thing is that the way it's organized through these bureaucracies, the principal at the door has to be able to greet a parent, and if a parent has a child with special needs, that principal has to have confidence that they can help your child. For years, because DC, when we first passed IDEA, for years a principal would say to you, you're going to need an attorney. That was the response of how you were going to get services for your child. I would put the services at the school level under the direction of the principals, and if it's a matter of scale, then they work 2 or 3 schools together. Because it's a centralized bureaucracy, we have cases where a child has speech therapy, and they are signed from downtown. The speech therapist goes to the school. Then they find out they have a problem in another school, another area, so they reassign the speech therapist and then have just someone else fill in for the other one. That's devastating for a child. They've been working with someone and have developed a relationship. So is the family. We have a bureaucratized, centralized special ed system that does not work well, but we are trying to rebuild it from a time when the district just gave up and never implemented IDEA.
We're only a few blocks from Hines Junior High. When I run through a couple of issues.
There's no S on that, Tom.
Hines.
It's Hine.
I know that it's like St. Elizabeth. There's no apostrophe. But Hines is a couple of blocks away. What is the status of that? You've gotten some grief on objecting to it. Where are we on that? Is it ever going to be built? It's right near the Eastern Market, where a lot of people who are watching this might know where that is, but don't know that empty building was Hine Junior High. As a journalist, I get the last word. But anyway, what's the status with Hine, real quickly?
Well, there's a lot of public engagement and a lot of public controversy on the height of the building, and
is it in limbo with suits now?
So the PUD was done, and there's been some neighbors have gotten together to challenge the PUD, and
around in court.
So it's in court, okay. But we're good at stopping things in DC. Unlike Stevens School, unlike the West End, Hine will go forward. It will get done. We're not going to be sitting with derelict buildings on there. I've shepherded it through as best I can with public input, But Hine will go and it'll be done before those other projects have been installed for even more
Soccer
years.
stadium in Southwest, off of South.
What about the soccer stadium in Southwest?
Well, what do you know about it? As you're elected a council member, what do you know? Have you been briefed by Alan Liu?
They came to me. Alan Liu came with the team and with Ackridge, and they talked about a proposal. And I said, you know what? Anytime we use public assets for now, like a building, we need to make it a priority that we get affordable workforce housing. We've got public housing, we've got Section 8 housing. What we don't have is if you make $35,000 to $65,000 a year, if you're going to live alone, it's almost impossible because you can't afford a place to live in the District of Columbia. That's workforce housing. So I told them that if we're going to trade, sell, whatever, the Reeves Center, that's a large public asset, that while the soccer stadium, I think, can activate and be great for Buzzard Point, but that there needed to be affordable housing attached to that.
In the Reeves Center at 14th and U, there's a discussion that could be this, it could be that. Jack Evans suggested, why don't we just sell it for the highest bidder and then make it that way? What was your suggestion?
That's the area, 14th and U, where it's very hard for people to live because it's so expensive. And I believe that whatever we do with that site, that it needs to include a substantial amount of workforce housing so that our teachers, our firefighters, our police folks, that they can live in the District of Columbia. And I would leverage, not the whole site for that, just needs to be part of the deal. We need to have workforce housing because we're losing it at a historic rate.
Whose taxes as mayor would you want to raise?
The camera's zooming in.
I strongly believe that the future of our city is dependent upon a transit system for DC. We've got a great commuter system, but if you're trying to get from east to west, from Ward 5 to Southwest, our neighborhoods do not connect. And I also know that people are going to keep moving here. If they all have to move here with their cars, the people that are car dependent will have no place to park and won't be able to drive in the city, and it'll be miserable. I strongly believe the way to do it is that we create a streetcar system. I would build all 37 miles of the streetcar system.
We're going to what happened to the tax?
Now, hold on.
He's getting there, I think.
And I would have
taking
it.
a roundabout.
He knows we have 4 minutes. He can go 3 on
The way that I would pay for it, the capital investment we paid for, the increased taxes on we know that the land value goes up. You capture that to pay for the capital investment. I would raise our sales tax by a penny, and like they did in Miami, to fund the system. And some people say, well, sales tax is a regressive tax. Think who most needs an affordable transit system. The circulator is just $1. To get to a job, we've got seniors on fixed income. We've got people on lower income who want to live in the city. Transit cost is the second highest cost to live here. We have a transit system like that moves you around to the city. That penny will be worth it.
So there was a time you wanted to raise taxes on the top earners in the city. The millionaire's tax, people were calling it. You no longer...
I believe that there should be a progressive tax, but if we're going to cut taxes because we're running surpluses, I'd make it progressive by increasing the standard deduction. So people who do not itemize, people who just take the standard deduction, keeps more of the money they make, and that would make it more progressive. And the top earners would be paying a higher percentage in that realm. It doesn't raise doesn't raise their taxes, but it means that the lower income earners are making less. Are paying less. I would increase the standard deduction, and that would make the income tax more progressive.
In the business the community, we have the highest taxes of the entire region. When people are looking, we have the new minimum wage going to that. We now have the highest cost of doing business in the city compared.
We
to
don't have that for individuals. Our resident taxes with homestead exemption, if you put it all together, we're competitive with Maryland and a little bit more than Virginia. I do believe that that in the event that we still run surpluses, if I were going to cut a tax, it would most likely, after raising the standard deduction, it would be the small business commercial property tax. I would do it with a separate schedule because they're on, triple net leases, so that you get a tax credit for what you pay for your increased taxes. That's how we have neighborhood businesses that can afford to be in neighborhoods where they don't get a homestead exemption, but we want locally owned businesses and not chains. The only way you can do that is by cutting their commercial property tax.
Did the Washington Post tell you today that Don Graham is taking his company, not the Post itself, but the TV stations, all of that. He's moving to Roslyn. The whole company, they're leaving. All that business is leaving Kaplan and all that to Roslyn. I mean, you have less than a minute.
Living Social came in and said, we need a tax break to put our headquarters here. I said, why do you need a tax break? How will it help? They said, that's because this is where our employees want to live. This is where they want to work. And we sell experiences, and people want to have those experiences in the District of Columbia. The growth of this city is not based on Donald Graham's businesses. The growth of the city is based on really where people want to live, work, and raise their families.
We didn't even get to the Washington football team, whether you support a team paid for stadium. You want to give a yes or no answer to that? Team paid for stadium at RFK, as long as the people up there have the rest of the land.
I could go for team paid for stadium.
We're out of time. Mark Segraves from Channel 4, Tommy Wells, Tom Sherwood, thank you for joining us.